Metal scraped concrete as Jake Morrison slid from beneath the rusted Honda, his weathered hands gripping a chrome wrench like a lifeline. The ambulance wheezed to a stop outside Morrison's auto, its engine coughing death rattles that cut through Millbrook's evening silence. Steam hissed from under the hood, while a young paramedic paced frantically beside the vehicle, his radio crackling with desperate updates about a critical patient inside. Jake's calloused fingers tightened around the worn tooltips, handle wrapped in electrical tape, its surface scarred by decades of honest work. Something about that siren's dying wail made his chest clench, made memories claw at the edges of his mind like hungry ghosts. Without a word, he strode toward the broken machine, the ancient wrench catching streetlight like a talisman. He had heard this sound before, the same mechanical death cry that had changed everything 3 years ago. Millbrook, Ohio had seen better days, much like the faded American flag hanging outside Peterson's Hardware and the boarded-up windows of what used to be Brennan Steelworks. The town's main artery, Route 19, stretched like a worn belt through neighborhoods, where porch lights flickered against the October chill and families gathered around dinner tables, counting pennies and prayers in equal measure. Jake Morrison's garage sat on the corner of Main and 3rd, its weathered brick facade bearing the ghost letters of Morrison's Auto Family Business since 1955. But those letters belonged to a different time, when Jake's father Tom had built engines with his bare hands and taught his son that honest work was the only currency that mattered. 3 years had passed since Sarah Morrison died on a rain-slicked stretch of Interstate 70 done, her sedan no match for an 18-wheeler that ran a red light in broad daylight. The truck driver walked away without a scratch, while Sarah never came home to tuck 8-year-old Emma into bed or kiss her husband goodnight. Jake hadn't spoken much since the funeral, channeling his grief into the rhythm of turning wrenches and the satisfaction of breathing life back into broken machines. His hands told the story of a man who worked through pain, grease embedded so deep in his fingerprints that soap had given up trying to wash it clean. Emma Morrison possessed her mother's green eyes and her father's stubborn streak, but at 8 years old, she carried wisdom that shouldn't belong to someone who still believed in the tooth fairy. She understood why Daddy sometimes stared at the empty chair at their kitchen table, and why he kept Mommy's coffee mug in the cabinet even though it never got used. Their trailer on Elm Street wasn't much. 2 bedrooms, a kitchen barely wide enough for one person, and a living room where the television's antenna had to be positioned just right to catch anything worth watching. But it was theirs, and Emma had learned that sometimes love lived in small spaces where every square inch mattered. The paramedic, a kid who couldn't have been more than 25, watched Jake approach with the desperate hope of a drowning man spotting a life preserver. "Sir, please, we've got a critical patient and the engine just died. Our backup is 20 minutes out and she doesn't have 20 minutes. Jake nodded once, popping the hood with practiced efficiency while his eyes scanned the engine bay like a doctor examining a patient. The problem revealed itself immediately. A blown radiator hose, simple enough to fix but requiring time they didn't have. "Got zip ties in your medical kit?" Jake asked, already knowing the answer by the confused look on the young man's face. He jogged back to his garage, returning with a handful of industrial ties and a water jug. 15 minutes later, the ambulance engine purred like a contented cat while Jake wiped his hands on a rag that had seen better decades. Through the rear window, he caught a glimpse of an elderly woman lying on the gurney, her silver hair spread across a white pillow, and her eyes tracking his movements with an intensity that made him uncomfortable. She looked like someone who had lived through enough history to write books about it, but there was something else in her gaze, a recognition that didn't make sense, since Jake was certain they'd never met. The paramedic pressed a $20 bill into Jake's palm, but he handed it back without a word. Some things couldn't be bought, and helping people wasn't one of them. As the ambulance disappeared into the distance, its red lights painting the autumn trees like scattered rubies, Jake felt that familiar hollowness settle in his chest. The same emptiness that had taken up residence the day Sarah died. The void that no amount of work or whiskey or late-night conversations with Emma could fill. He gathered his tools slowly, each wrench and socket finding its designated home in the worn toolbox his father had passed down, along with calloused hands and an unshakable work ethic. Tomorrow he'd return to Roy's Automotive, where he fixed other people's cars for $12 an hour, and tried not to think about the garage that still bore his family's name. But tonight, he'd go home to Emma and pretend that helping strangers was enough to keep the ghosts at bay. 3 days later, Eleanor Hartwell walked into Roy's Automotive wearing a wool coat that had seen better seasons, and carrying herself like a woman who had learned to make herself smaller than she actually was. Her silver hair was pulled back in a simple bun, and her only jewelry was a plain gold wedding band that caught the fluorescent lights as she approached the service counter. She'd told the teenager behind the desk that her Honda Civic was making strange noises, though Jake would later discover that the car ran perfectly fine. Roy assigned Jake to the job with a grunt and a reminder that they were behind on state inspections. But Jake had already noticed something about the woman that set his teeth on edge. Eleanor Hartwell watched Jake work with the intensity of a hawk studying prey, though there was nothing predatory in her gaze, just a sadness so deep it seemed to pull light from the room. She asked careful questions about the town, about the businesses that had closed and the families that had stayed, and Jake found himself answering despite his usual reluctance to make conversation with customers. She knew things about Millbrook that only longtime residents should know, like how the old Miller farm had been subdivided in the 1980s and how the high school football team hadn't won a championship since 1973. When Jake mentioned these coincidences, Eleanor simply smiled and said she'd done her research. The Honda's engine revealed no problems, as Jake had suspected from the moment he lifted the hood. But Eleanor insisted on paying for a full diagnostic anyway, leaving a tip that was 3 times larger than necessary and asking if Jake might recommend a good place for coffee. Mabel's Diner sat at the intersection of Main and Elm, its red vinyl booths and black and white checkered floor unchanged since the Eisenhower administration. Eleanor ordered pie she didn't eat, while Jake nursed coffee that tasted like it had been brewing since breakfast. They talked about nothing and everything. The weather, the town's history, the way certain songs on the jukebox could transport you back to moments you thought you'd forgotten. Jake found himself mentioning Emma, how she was too smart for her own good and how she still asked when Mommy was coming home, even though she understood the answer. Eleanor listened with the kind of attention that made you feel like your words mattered, her hands wrapped around a coffee cup that grew cold while she absorbed every detail about the little girl with green eyes and a stubborn streak. When Jake described Emma's latest art project, a crayon drawing of their family that included a woman with wings watching over them, Eleanor's composure cracked just enough for Jake to notice. But when he asked if she was all right, she quickly composed herself and changed the subject to the weather. As autumn deepened into winter, Eleanor became a regular fixture at Roy's Automotive, always finding something wrong with her perfectly functioning Honda, and always requesting Jake specifically. She brought Emma small gifts, coloring books, hair ribbons, a stuffed elephant with floppy ears that quickly became the little girl's favorite possession. Jake accepted these offerings reluctantly, his pride warring with his practical understanding that Emma deserved whatever small joys life offered. Eleanor never stayed long during these visits, but she watched Emma with an expression that Jake couldn't quite decipher, like she was memorizing every freckle and every laugh. The questions started when Jake realized Eleanor knew too much about his family's history. She mentioned that Morrison's Auto had been a landmark in the community, spoke fondly of Tom Morrison's reputation for honest work, and somehow knew that Sarah had been a teacher at Millbrook Elementary before Emma was born. When Jake pressed her about how she had come by this information, Eleanor deflected with the skill of someone who had spent years avoiding difficult conversations. She claimed to have spoken with longtime residents, to have researched the town's business history, but her answers felt rehearsed in a way that made Jake's instincts prickle with suspicion. The breaking point came on a December afternoon when Eleanor let slip Sarah's maiden name during a casual conversation about the elementary school's holiday pageant. Jake had never mentioned Sarah's full name to anyone at Roy's, and the way Eleanor said Sarah Bennett Morrison carried the weight of familiarity rather than recently acquired knowledge. When Jake confronted her about it, Eleanor's carefully constructed facade crumbled like autumn leaves. Her hands trembled as she reached for her purse, her voice barely above a whisper as she claimed she must have heard the name somewhere around town. But Jake knew the sound of guilt when he heard it, and Eleanor Hartwell was drowning in it. That evening, Jake made a phone call to his sister-in-law in Cleveland, asking questions he should have asked months ago. 20 minutes later, he had answers that made his blood run cold and his hands shake as he gripped the phone. Sarah Bennett Morrison had been killed by a truck belonging to Hartwell Industries, a transportation company owned by a reclusive billionaire named Eleanor Hartwell. The accident report mentioned mechanical failure and driver fatigue, but the case had been settled out of court for an undisclosed amount that Jake had never seen a penny of because the lawyers had sent the check to an address he'd moved from years earlier. Eleanor Hartwell had been paying for Emma's school supplies, her medical checkups, her winter clothes, all through anonymous donations that Jake had attributed to community generosity. The confrontation happened in the parking lot of Roy's Automotive on a Thursday afternoon, when the December wind cut through Jake's work jacket like a blade made of winter itself. Eleanor arrived for her usual appointment, but instead of bringing her car around back, Jake met her at the front door with eyes that burned like coals and fists clenched tight enough to crack knuckles. "Eleanor Hartwell," he said, and the way her face crumpled told him everything he needed to know. She didn't try to deny it, didn't offer excuses or explanations. Just stood there in her wool coat and sensible shoes, while Jake's world rearranged itself around this new and terrible truth. "Your trucks killed my wife," Jake said, his voice steady despite the earthquake happening in his chest. Eleanor nodded, tears streaming down cheeks that looked like they'd forgotten how to cry until this moment. "I know," she whispered. "I've known since the day it happened. I've been trying to find a way to—" But Jake cut her off with a gesture that could have stopped traffic. "To what, buy your way out of guilt? Pay me off like those lawyers tried to do?" Eleanor shook her head, her composure dissolving like sugar in rain. "To make amends, to do something, anything that might balance the scales." The truth poured out of Eleanor like water from a broken dam, each word carrying the weight of 3 years' worth of sleepless nights and unanswered prayers. The truck driver had been working double shifts for a month, hopped up on caffeine and barely legal stimulants to meet impossible delivery deadlines. The truck's brakes had been overdue for maintenance, but the company's cost-cutting measures had pushed safety inspections to the breaking point. Eleanor had inherited the business from her late husband, a man who'd built an empire on the backs of working families and the willingness to cut corners when profits demanded it. She'd tried to reform the company after the accident, but the damage was done. Sarah Morrison was still dead, and no amount of improved safety protocols could bring her back. "I sold the company," Eleanor said, her voice breaking like old wood under pressure. "Donated most of the money, kept just enough to live simply and to help families like yours. Families we destroyed." Jake stared at this woman who had infiltrated his life under false pretenses, who had played with his daughter's affections and manipulated his trust. "You think money fixes everything? You think helping Emma makes up for killing her mother?" Eleanor's face contorted with pain that seemed to radiate from her bones. "No," she said, "nothing makes up for that. But doing nothing felt like killing her twice." Jake's supervisor, Roy, chose that moment to step outside for a cigarette break, taking in the scene with the calculating eyes of a man who'd witnessed enough workplace drama to recognize trouble when it wore a wool coat and expensive shoes. "Morrison, you're supposed to be working on Mrs. Patterson's Buick, not chatting with customers in the parking lot." Jake turned to face his boss, his hands still trembling with rage and revelation. "I'm having a personal conversation," he said. Roy's expression hardened as he processed the tension crackling between Jake and Eleanor like electricity before a storm. "Personal conversations happen on personal time. Right now, you're on my time, and my time costs money." "Then fire me," Jake said, the words falling from his lips before his brain had time to process them. Roy's eyebrows climbed toward his receding hairline while Eleanor watched this exchange with growing horror. "Excuse me?" Roy said. "Fire me," Jake repeated, louder this time. "I'm tired of fixing other people's problems while mine pile up like snow. I'm tired of working for someone who thinks money is more important than people. And I'm really tired of pretending that $12 an hour is enough to build a life on." Roy's face flushed red as a stop sign. Fine. Clean out your toolbox and get off my property. And don't expect a reference. Jake gathered his tools with the methodical precision of a man who'd been fired from better jobs for worse reasons, each wrench and socket finding its place, while Eleanor watched from the sidelines like a spectator at her own execution. When he finished, he turned to face her one last time, his father's toolbox heavy in his hands, and his future suddenly as uncertain as Ohio weather in springtime. "Stay away from Emma," he said. "Stay away from both of us. Your guilt doesn't get to live in our house." Eleanor nodded through her tears, understanding that some bridges burned completely and left nothing but ash where forgiveness might have grown. That night, Jake sat at his kitchen table with a beer he didn't want and bills he couldn't pay, watching Emma color a picture of their family while the winter wind rattled their trailer's windows like bones in a cup. She'd drawn herself between two adults, one labeled Daddy and one labeled Grandma Ellie, and the sight of Eleanor's representation in his daughter's artwork felt like salt in a wound that refused to heal. Emma looked up from her crayons with eyes that missed nothing, and asked why Grandma Ellie hadn't come to see them lately. Jake struggled for an answer that wouldn't shatter his daughter's world while simultaneously holding his own together. "Sometimes grown-ups have problems that kids can't fix," he said finally, which was both true and completely inadequate. Emma considered this with the seriousness of a Supreme Court justice, then asked if Daddy's problems were the kind that money could fix. Jake almost laughed at the irony. His problems were caused by money, created by money, and seemingly impossible to solve without money. Instead, he told Emma that the most important problems couldn't be fixed with dollars and cents, but with time and patience and the willingness to forgive people who'd made terrible mistakes. Emma nodded, like she understood, though Jake suspected she was processing concepts that would take him years to fully grasp. The call came at 2 a.m. on a Tuesday in January, jarring Jake from dreams where Sarah was still alive, and Eleanor Hartwell had never existed. Emma's fever had spiked to 104 degrees, her small body racked with chills that made her teeth chatter like castanets in a mariachi band. Jake wrapped her in every blanket they owned and drove through empty streets to Millbrook General Hospital, his heart hammering against his ribs while Emma drifted in and out of consciousness in the passenger seat. The emergency room doctor diagnosed pneumonia and recommended immediate admission, but when Jake tried to provide insurance information, the receptionist informed him that his coverage had been terminated along with his employment. "I can pay," Jake lied, knowing his checking account contained exactly $137 and change. The hospital's billing department was less optimistic about his financial prospects, suggesting payment plans that would stretch into Emma's college years and government assistance programs that required paperwork he didn't have time to complete while his daughter fought infection with the determination of a prizefighter. Jake spent the next 6 hours in a plastic chair beside Emma's hospital bed, watching IV fluids drip steadily into her small arm, while nurses checked her temperature and blood pressure with the efficiency of pit crews at a NASCAR race. Eleanor appeared in the doorway like a ghost made flesh, her silver hair disheveled, and her wool coat bearing evidence of having been thrown on in haste. Jake's first instinct was to order her out, to protect Emma from the woman who'd destroyed their family while pretending to care about it. But Emma's eyes lit up when she saw her surrogate grandmother, and she reached out with the hand that wasn't connected to medical equipment. "Grandma Ellie," she whispered, her voice hoarse from fever and medication. Eleanor approached the bed as if walking through a minefield, her eyes seeking Jake's permission for every step. "I heard about Emma," Eleanor said quietly. "The hospital called me as her emergency contact." Jake's confusion must have been written across his face in block letters, because Eleanor quickly explained that she'd been listed as Emma's grandmother on the school's records, a detail that someone had apparently entered without his knowledge or consent. "I can explain later," Eleanor said. "Right now, Emma needs treatment, and I've already spoken with the billing department." Jake's pride rose in his throat like bile, but before he could protest, Eleanor held up a hand. "This isn't charity. This is responsibility. My company put Emma in this hospital bed the day it killed her mother." The pneumonia broke on Thursday morning like a fever, finally surrendering to medicine and prayer, leaving Emma weak but breathing easily for the first time in days. Eleanor had maintained a vigil in the corner chair, dozing fitfully while nurses came and went with the regularity of tides. She'd brought books and puzzles and a tablet loaded with Emma's favorite movies, transforming the sterile hospital room into something resembling a home away from home. Jake watched this woman, who'd destroyed his life, pour herself into saving his daughters, and the contradiction made his head spin, like a carnival ride designed by someone with a cruel sense of humor. During Emma's recovery, Eleanor finally told the whole truth about the night Sarah died. The truck driver, Tommy Rodriguez, had been working his third consecutive double shift to pay for his own daughter's medical bills. The company's safety protocols had been systematically ignored to meet increasingly impossible delivery schedules, and the brake maintenance that might have prevented the accident had been postponed indefinitely to save money. Eleanor had discovered these facts during her own investigation, hiring private detectives and accident reconstruction experts to understand exactly how her inherited empire had murdered an innocent woman. Tommy Rodriguez killed himself 6 months after the accident, Eleanor said, her voice flat as roadkill. Left behind a wife and 2 daughters. The guilt ate him alive. Jake absorbed this information like a sponge, soaking up poison, understanding for the first time that Sarah's death had claimed more than one victim. Eleanor continued, describing how she'd tried to help Rodriguez's family, how she'd sold the trucking company and used the proceeds to establish a foundation for families affected by transportation accidents. Money can't bring Sarah back, she said, but it can prevent other Sarahs from dying needlessly. Jake stared at Eleanor across Emma's hospital bed, this woman who'd carried the weight of his wife's death for 3 years while he'd been carrying his own burden of grief and rage. She looked smaller now, diminished by confession and exhausted by the effort of maintaining her deception. "Why didn't you just tell me from the beginning?" he asked. Eleanor's laugh contained no humor, just the bitter recognition of her own cowardice. "Because I knew you'd react exactly the way you did. Because I was selfish enough to want Emma to love me before she learned to hate me. Because I thought I could earn forgiveness before asking for it." Emma stirred in her hospital bed, her green eyes focusing on the 2 adults who'd been whispering at the edges of her consciousness. "Are you and Grandma Ellie fighting?" she asked, her voice still rough from illness, but carrying the authority of someone who'd inherited her father's directness and her mother's intuition. Jake looked at Eleanor, then back at his daughter, struggling to find words that would explain adult complexities to a child who deserved simple truths. "We're talking about grown-up things," he said finally. Emma considered this with the gravity of a judge reviewing evidence, then announced that grown-ups were terrible at talking, and maybe they should try listening instead. The wisdom of 8-year-olds struck Jake like lightning, illuminating a dark landscape, revealing truths he'd been too angry to see. Eleanor wasn't his enemy. She was another casualty of the same tragedy that had claimed Sarah's life and Tommy Rodriguez's sanity. She'd been living with guilt that was both entirely justified and completely useless, punishing herself for crimes she hadn't personally committed but had certainly enabled. Jake had been living with grief that was equally justified and equally useless, allowing his pain to blind him to the possibility that healing might require forgiveness rather than justice. Eleanor left the hospital that evening with promises to respect Jake's wishes about contact with Emma, but she also left behind an envelope containing a business proposal that Jake almost threw away unopened. Inside, he found detailed plans for reopening Morrison's Auto, with Eleanor as a silent partner, her investment conditional only on Jake's willingness to accept help without sacrificing his dignity. The garage could be restored to its former glory while remaining a Morrison family business, with Eleanor's money serving as seed capital rather than charity. The proposal included fair wages for Jake, a college fund for Emma, and complete autonomy over daily operations. 3 weeks later, Jake stood outside the empty shell of Morrison's Auto with his father's toolbox in one hand and a set of new keys in the other, watching Emma trace the faded letters on the building's brick facade with the reverence of an archaeologist discovering lost civilization. Eleanor had kept her word about maintaining distance, conducting all business through lawyers and contractors, while Jake supervised the restoration. New equipment arrived daily: hydraulic lifts, diagnostic computers, tool cabinets that gleamed like altarpieces in a church dedicated to the religion of honest work. The past and future collided in that moment, his father's legacy rising from the ashes of his own failures. Eleanor appeared at the garage's grand reopening like a ghost seeking redemption, her presence both unexpected and somehow inevitable. She stood at the back of the small crowd that had gathered to witness Morrison's return to Main Street, her silver hair catching autumn sunlight, while Emma bounced between well-wishers like a pinball powered by pure excitement. When their eyes met across the crowded garage bay, Jake felt something shift in his chest. Not forgiveness exactly, but the possibility of it. Eleanor raised her hand in a small wave, and Jake found himself nodding in response, a gesture that acknowledged their shared history without absolving anyone of anything. Emma ran to Eleanor with the fearless affection of childhood, wrapping small arms around the woman who'd been both stranger and grandmother, enemy and benefactor. "Grandma Ellie, look, Daddy's garage is back!" Eleanor knelt to Emma's level, her composure cracking as she absorbed the little girl's joy like medicine for wounds that refused to heal. "It's beautiful, sweetheart. Your daddy worked very hard to make this happen." Emma looked back at Jake with pride that could have powered the town's streetlights, then whispered something in Eleanor's ear that made the older woman's eyes fill with tears. As the crowd dispersed and the afternoon light slanted through the garage's windows like golden syrup, Jake found himself alone with Eleanor for the first time since the hospital. They stood among the tools and equipment that represented second chances and complicated redemption, neither speaking, while Emma played with a wrench that was almost as big as she was. "Thank you," Jake said finally, the words feeling inadequate but necessary. Eleanor shook her head. "I didn't do this for thanks. I did it because some debts can't be paid with money, but they can be honored with action." Jake understood then that Eleanor would always be part of their story, not as the villain who'd destroyed their family, but as the unlikely guardian who'd helped them rebuild from the wreckage. She would never replace Sarah. No one could. But she might become something else entirely, something that didn't have a name but felt like family, shaped by tragedy and tempered by forgiveness. Emma looked up from her play with eyes that held her mother's wisdom and her father's stubbornness, and in that moment, Jake saw their future stretching ahead like an open road, leading toward possibilities he'd thought were lost forever. 8 months later, Morrison's Auto had become the unofficial heart of Main Street again, its bay doors open to the world, and its waiting room filled with the comfortable chaos of a business that valued people over profits. Eleanor had taken to stopping by most mornings with coffee and Danish from Mabel's diner, not as an intruder, but as someone who'd earned her place through patience and persistence. She helped with paperwork, answered phones, and entertained Emma after school while Jake worked on engines that purred under his experienced hands like contented cats. Jake still talked to Sarah sometimes, usually while working late in the garage when the world grew quiet enough to hear memories whisper in the darkness. He told her about Emma's straight A's and her growing collection of stuffed elephants, about Eleanor's transformation from destroyer to protector, about the way forgiveness felt less like absolution and more like choosing to carry lighter burdens. Sarah didn't answer, but Jake imagined she approved of the choices he'd made, not because they were perfect, but because they were made with love for their daughter and hope for their future. The anniversary of Sarah's death passed quietly that year, marked not with the bitter remembrance that had characterized previous years, but with a celebration of the life she'd lived and the love she'd left behind. Jake, Emma, and Eleanor visited the cemetery together, bringing flowers that Emma had picked from the garden behind the garage and stories about the year that had passed since Eleanor's truth had changed everything. They stood together beside Sarah's headstone like a family forged by loss and choice, rather than blood and tradition, understanding that love could take many forms, and that healing sometimes required accepting help from unexpected sources. Eleanor had aged visibly over the months, her silver hair now completely white and her steps slightly slower, but her eyes had lost the haunted quality that had marked her initial appearance in their lives. She'd found peace not through forgiveness, Jake wasn't sure that had happened yet, but through purpose, through the daily act of showing up and being useful and proving that people could change if they wanted it badly enough. Emma had taken to calling her Nana L, a compromise between formality and intimacy that satisfied everyone involved. In the crisp October evening, exactly 1 year after the ambulance had broken down outside the old Morrison's auto, Jake sat in his restored garage with a cup of coffee gone cold, and the day's last customer long departed. Emma was at the workbench, attempting to organize tools with the seriousness of a surgeon preparing for a complex operation, while Eleanor swept the floor with the methodical precision of someone who'd learned to find meditation in simple tasks. The chrome wrench that had started everything sat in its designated place in Jake's toolbox, its surface still scarred but somehow brighter, like an old friend who'd weathered storms and emerged stronger. Emma held up the wrench with both hands, struggling slightly under its weight. "Daddy, why is this one so special?" she asked, her green eyes curious, in the way that only children's eyes could be. Jake considered the question, thinking about inheritance and legacy, about the tools that shaped men and the men who shape tools. "Because it reminds me that everything can be fixed if you're willing to work hard enough," he said. Eleanor looked up from her sweeping, catching Jake's eye with a smile that contained gratitude and grief in equal measure, understanding that he wasn't talking only about engines. The garage grew quiet, except for the soft sounds of Emma's organizational efforts and the distant hum of traffic on Route 19, carrying travelers toward destinations unknown. Jake looked around at the space his father had built, that he had lost, and that Eleanor's guilt and generosity had restored, understanding that this was what redemption looked like. Not dramatic gestures or grand proclamations, but the daily choice to show up and do the work, and believe that tomorrow might be better than today. Outside, Millbrook's streetlights flickered to life like small stars refusing to surrender to darkness, illuminating a town where second chances were possible and families could be built from the most unlikely materials. Eleanor finished sweeping and leaned the broom against the wall, then walked over to where Emma was still struggling with the chrome wrench. "Here, sweetheart, let me help you," she said, her hands covering Emma's smaller ones as they carefully placed the tool in its proper home. Jake watched this scene, his daughter and the woman who'd killed her mother working together over the instrument that had brought them all together, and felt something settle in his chest like a puzzle piece finally finding its place. It wasn't forgiveness, not yet, but it was acceptance, and sometimes acceptance was enough to build a life on. As they prepared to close the garage for the night, Emma asked if they could have pancakes for breakfast, the kind with chocolate chips that Nana L made on Sunday mornings. Eleanor looked to Jake for permission, a question in her eyes that had become familiar over the months. Jake nodded, understanding that their strange little family had developed its own traditions and rhythms, its own way of moving through the world that honored the past while embracing an uncertain but hopeful future. They turned off the lights and locked the doors, walking together into the Ohio evening with the comfortable ease of people who'd learned that love could grow in the most unexpected soil. The chrome wrench rested in its toolbox, waiting for the next emergency, the next opportunity to fix something broken. Like the three people who'd entrusted their futures to each other despite the terrible history that bound them together, it was scarred but serviceable, damaged but not destroyed, ready to be useful in ways that its maker had never imagined. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and old ghosts, but tonight, in a small town where factories had closed and dreams had downsized, a mechanic, a billionaire, and a little girl with green eyes proved that sometimes the most beautiful families were the ones that nobody could have planned.